Hey, everybody, and welcome to Open Classroom. I'm Janet Gillow, the Director of Professional Development for the Brown School, and I'm so happy to have you with us as part of today's program. For folks joining us on the Zoom webinar, you probably know the deal by now that we can't see or hear you, but the chat feature is enabled, and we really do want this to be a group conversation. So please, as the presentation goes, share your greetings, your thoughts, your comments, and we will find a way to bring you into the room. For folks joining us on YouTube, we're delighted to have you here, and we're not able to moderate any comments posted on YouTube. But before I turn the program over today, I want to first thank and acknowledge my friends and colleagues that are joining to do the harder work. Atia Thurman is here. She's our Associate Director for the Clark Fox Policy Institute, and she's going to moderate the Q&A. And Dan Ferris is going to lead us off in just a minute. He's our Assistant Dean for Policy Initiatives. But before I send the mic over to Dan, I want to invite the audience. We've got programs now scheduled really through the end of the calendar year. Particularly in the summer, we're just doing our core Tuesday time slot like we are right now. So we're back 1 week from today. Brown School alum Kaylee Cornelison is doing a program for us on identifying digital dating abuse. And then a week after that, Washington University wellness consultant Meg Cretchy is going to do a program for us on mindfulness practices to prepare for the school year ahead. I'm not ready to think about the school year ahead, but it's coming, and a little preparation is never a bad thing. So with that, I'm going to turn things over to Dan to introduce today's speaker.
Perfect. Thanks so much, and welcome everyone. I'm Dan Ferris. I use he, him pronouns. I'm the Assistant Dean for Policy Initiatives at the Brown School. I also lead training and education initiatives at the Social Policy Institute. Thank you, Janet and the Professional Development Office for supporting and offering these incredible learning and community building opportunities. It's great as I'm looking through the chat and the participants to see some familiar names as well as some new names and faces to the space. So as Janet mentioned, we're also joined today for the discussion and Q&A by my amazing colleague and a great partner in all things policy, Atia Thurman, who I know is a familiar name and face to the Open Classroom community. She's the Associate Director for Clark Fox Policy Institute and also the Manager of Brown School Equity and Inclusion Initiatives. So authenticity is a concept not always front and center in policy training and teaching. If you were with us for the pre-show banter, you've already gotten a little bit of a sneak peek to how we're thinking and talking about this. Instead, traditional policy work is often presented and framed around it being adversarial in nature and purely about winning or losing, or conversely, requiring us to be objective in our research and analysis. So for those interested in advancing policy and systems change, there couldn't be a more important topic or more important time to examine and advance strategies and practices around advocacy. And what an incredible opportunity we have here today to learn from an amazing leader and colleague in Ian Forber-Pratt. I'll briefly introduce and turn things over to. So Ian is Chief Executive Officer at the Institute for Child Welfare Innovation and the Director of Global Advocacy for Children's Emergency Relief International. His past and present work spans fields, disciplines, and continents as he brings his own life experience together with previous education and training in history, philosophy, and yes, social work as a proud alum of the Brown School. So Ian has conceptualized and developed a new course being offered this fall in the Brown School's Master of Social Policy program. So whether you're enrolled in the class and getting a head start here, or just part of the larger Open Classroom community and passionate about the topic, it's my privilege and pleasure to welcome you today, to thank you for joining us, and to turn things over to Ian for the session.
All right, Dan, thank you very much. Atia, Janet, thank you very much for this opportunity. I'm so grateful to be here with all of you. The hope for today is that this is conversational, a little bit informal in tone, and that it's just kind of an unfoldment of, as Dan already mentioned, the idea of authenticity, relationships, how you show up yourself, and how that infuses or can infuse into advocacy and policy work. So first, just to give a statement of myself for anybody who is listening to this and not seeing it for whatever reason. I am an Indian man with not very much hair and a little bit of facial hair, about 41 years old, wearing a gray tie and a dress shirt. And I'm just so grateful to be here with you all. So a little tiny bit about me. So I bring lived experience to the field of child welfare, in which I've been gratefully working for the past 20 years. And I was adopted from India and actually raised in the US. So I kind of span both kind of continents or cultures, as Dan mentioned. But then I have been working in the US in domestic policy reform and working in child welfare for the past couple of years, and working globally before that. I've been lucky enough to be part of drafting legislation in India and influencing global legislation and policy, both in the US and throughout the world. So we have about 30 minutes to go over a little bit of content here, and then I would adore having any questions, dialogue in the chat box throughout, and then we'll get to all of it for a full time afterwards of 30 minutes. And I'll have a prompt at the end. So the first part of this talk, we'll talk about the why, the idea of why are we here together and what do we hope to accomplish in this time? And then go into what I call a policy conundrum. And we're going to talk about child welfare in the United States today as a case study, and look at the Families First Act and talk a little bit about how one might show up as themselves and authentically in advocating for this act. And we'll look at a theory called diffusion of innovation theory. So the big picture here is that I hope you walk away with a bit of tools, language, just being in the thought space of how you can bring yourself confidently to any situation where you are advocating for something. And this happens in relationships. You're advocating for something within your own relationship, with others around. You're advocating for a new idea into your community, or you're advocating for a policy. And then, of course, for those of you that are working in the policy making space or trying to influence policy, how do you bring yourself and an authentic message into what Dan had mentioned, rooms that are often all about objectivity, or they are kind of binary in some way or another. You say this thing or you say that thing. You're on this side of the argument or that side of the argument. And so we'll talk about the multidimensionality and all of that. And then that third one there, I'd like to expose you, as I mentioned, to this Families First Services and Prevention Act, and just give a quick overview of what it looks like as a case study, and then look at how this diffusion of innovation theory might be a way that we can think about how to bring your authentic self. So let me go back here. We'll start with a couple definitions. You can read them in front of you, of course, but I'm going to orally read them a little bit for anybody that's not reading these things. But the idea of advocacy, on which we're going to center this conversation, is public support for or recommendation of a particular cause or policy. So as we think about authentic showing up, when you're trying to garner support around you or having a recommendation for something, a lot of times we can be very calculated about, all right, so what do I say in this particular moment to make sure that my goal is achieved? And a lot of times in that dialogue, your own kind of passion around something or the reason that you came to the table might get lost. And so the authenticity that we'll be talking about today, I've kind of put both sides there. The definition is of undisputed origin or genuine. And then the definition of genuine is truly what something is said to be, authentic. And so I want to stop for a moment and just sit in the space of those words next to genuine. Truly what something is said to be. And I believe that often we don't take the license or the agency or the confidence to really say exactly what we mean. And we'll talk about how that can be kind of a tug of war within yourself a little bit later. But how many times in a policy room do you feel like, oh, maybe that person's not saying what they really mean, or the politics or the economics or the race or whatever it looks like are coming into this in a way that somebody is not truly showing up in what they really mean or what you believe they mean. And then all of that culminates in this idea of what is self, a person's essential being that distinguishes them from others. And I'll just stop at that part of the definition. The idea that every single person in a policy room is distinguishable from everybody else in that policy room. And they bring value and experience to the table. And very often that value and experience kind of gets shrouded or hidden in whatever we've decided are the kind of binary, kind of rigid ways that policy needs to be developed. So this slide starts talking about and gives kind of a view into the complexity, I believe, of authentic advocacy or policymaking. So as you can see there, everything from what is true to how you are intentioned, all the way down to code switching and cultural competence. Everything here, all of those, each one of them a somewhat complex concept to figure out how do you bring that to the table. All of those things can happen in sequence or simultaneously during a policy or an advocacy situation. So we're going to come back to this slide as the prompt at the end of the discussion, but for now, let me get into real examples. So I'm wondering if you'd put in the chat, and Atia, would you mind kind of popping in and sharing what people say? I'm wondering if anybody has heard of the Families First Prevention and Services Act. Chat two here so I can see it. Dan, are we seeing anything come into the chat about if anyone has heard of this act?
It's a nice mix. So
yeah,
hard to take a poll exactly, but it looks maybe like 50-50-ish coming through. Lots of no's, a few
mostly
yeses.
a lot of no's. Yeah, haven't, have not. Nope. The no's are winning.
And here's the thing that's fascinating. That's what I suspected. So people who are part of the child welfare field may or may not have heard that, but probably proportionately more people have heard about it. But people who are passionate about the world and human beings just moving about often have not heard of this act. And it is literally game-changing, fundamentally forever in life, a change to the way children are cared for in America. And it has huge amounts, billions of dollars attached to how things are changing around. And so it's one of those interesting policy things where you're like, wow, I can't believe this huge policy changed and we didn't know about it. And so I want to take a step back and we'll dive into the child welfare field quickly to give a frame of this policy and then talk about authenticity and self and how it is important in regard to this policy. So for many of you that know of the child welfare field, you might know of just foster care or just adoption. Well, the child welfare field actually is the full gamut of everything from supporting children and families so that they do not have to be separated to, unfortunately, what we see often is the removal of children, and then children being in foster homes, in adoptive homes, or aging out of the foster care system. And these days, this act and many other dialogues in the child welfare field are talking about how we're supporting relatives in kinship care. It's its own universe and it's huge. But that is just the US universe in regard to this act. Globally, the world is moving from big orphanages to family-based care. So all of the things that you can see that involve a family, foster care, kinship care, family strengthening, all those things. And the United States is the first in the world that is reforming a child welfare system in round 2. The globe right now is moving from big orphanages to family-based care and predominantly foster care. And the US is the first to put money and policy together, which are two of the fundamental aspects of actual social change happening, to move from foster care and small group homes to prevention and community-based care work. And I believe, at least in my opinion, the intentionality of that, of seeing families as strong and able and capable, is absolutely beautiful. But what this act has done in part is created a conundrum. Because in the child welfare system, bureaucratically, it is set up right now to transactionalize children. Children get removed, they get taken care of by the state, they get moved around, and they age out of the system at 18 or 21. And this act is asking these child-serving organizations basically to put themselves out of business as they stand. And so, as you can imagine, policy advocacy right now and organizations, individuals are standing up and saying, hey, we didn't even know this policy was coming. Now this policy is here, and we can't believe the effect that it's having on us. And we're just beginning to process that we either have to go out of business in the way we serve children, or we have to adapt and pivot as quickly as we possibly can. And money is involved. So as you can see here, the foster care work and what we're talking about, the space that this Families First Act is in, is over 50% of the amount of money spent in child welfare. So you have all these people that want to advocate for something different, but are just so overwhelmed by how much money is attached. They don't know how to get to the money, and they're feeling all of these things inside, all of these individuals who are working in organizations every day and being asked to change the game completely. And they're struggling to authentically show up. So the questions that they're asking are, and what I've been asking this whole time is, how does this act exist that not a lot of people know about it? How is everything affected after 2 years of a pandemic? This act was passed, this policy was passed in 2018, and then delayed and delayed, and now kicking in September of 2021. And how does everybody manage that it's asking everyone to think differently? So I'd like to go through this chart and then get right into a lot of questions about how somebody could show up authentically in this space. So the Families First Act was passed, as I mentioned, in 2018, and a lot of innovators, so that green, yellow, light orange, dark orange, and red there is the diffusion of innovation theory. It's the idea how any new idea seeds itself into society. And the piece here is that that new idea, and let's take Families First as our example right now, there are a bunch of innovators in the beginning that always are like, okay, yes, this new idea, we're bought in, we're excited about it. And then it ramps up a little bit that you've got early adopters, people that are said, okay, yeah, now I've seen a little bit of proof and I'm interested in this thing. And then there is a chasm. And that chasm happens always where basically that new idea is not yet at a critical mass of buy-in, and people are moving from basically a sales mentality to a proof mentality, which basically means those innovators and early adopters are having to basically sell this new idea to people and say, hey, there's value here, there's excitedness in here, et cetera. And then once you get to that early mentality, majority and late majority, they're saying, okay, prove this concept and then we'll buy it. And between that sales and the proof, it takes time, it takes implementation structures, it takes policy iterations, and a lot of times new ideas actually extinguish or they can't get through the chasm. Now, at the same time, this S curve, this big S curve that I've overlaid here, this is now my research and my opinion, is how policy can kind of come in the very beginning of innovators and early adopters, and this is where I see Families First right now, is at that symbolic policy change at the top of the S curve between innovators and early adopters. And so that policy comes in and it asks everyone to think differently and look at things differently. And unfortunately, the dissonance that happens in asking people to think and look at things differently then ends up with usually decreased positive outcomes. And the reason for that is that the systems are not in place for that big change to happen, and the majority buy-in isn't there, but it's already rolling and things have to be changing. And so as you can see here, what I believe is in the next 10 to 20 years, the families first work is going to dip into this chasm and then come out, hopefully, into a round of socially bought in policy. Now, how does all of this have to do with relationships and authentic advocacy? So I'm going to leave this as the backdrop for another couple minutes and challenge you all to think about a question that I hope will turn into dialogue later on. And the idea is, say that you buy into, oh, I'm sorry about that. I've actually written this out. So say that you are part of a state level team and you've got to create a plan to roll out this Families First legislation. And it has to be approved by the federal government. And you kind of buy into that last slide. You're thinking, oh goodness. So actually we are headed towards a chasm, and we are headed towards what we might believe are decreased positive outcomes for young people in the next little bit. But you are advocating to a state who is paying you to do this work that believes that they have created the best plan ever. So I'll put this back up and I'll begin to dive another couple layers more deep. A lot of times, you now, a consultant who is trying to advocate a state, will struggle with how much of yourself can you genuinely bring to this. If you are struggling to say, all right, I believe the state is not doing the right thing or their plan is not working, how much of yourself and the information that you've compiled are you allowed to bring to that group while still keeping your job or keeping your amount of influence in policy? And so those are some of the questions, and I'll go back to this. It means that is the authentic you of saying, okay, we're headed into a chasm, does it mean that you say absolutely everything that you know? Or does it actually mean that you say half of what you know because you know that if you say all of it, that people will just stop listening to you? Or if you are advocating for A, B, C, and D, but at the same time, you know that if you advocate for C, D, E, and F as well, you're going to lose any momentum that you had. So maybe your authentic self says, I need to advocate for all of these things at once. But you realize that if I do that, I get none of them. So all of these questions come back to the prompt that I'd like to give, and we can get right into the structure and the questions that we have. So imagine yourself navigating all of the various factors that I've overlaid in your advocacy and policy work. And I'm going to go back to slide 6, and I'm going to open it up to everyone. What is one word on that screen that resonates with you and means the most to you, and why? Especially if you'd like to, in this scenario of the Families First Act, but in any advocacy or policy that you've been thinking through. So again, the prompt on this screen here is, when you think of authentically showing up in a policy space or an advocacy space, what is one word in here that truly connects with you, or one phrase that connects with you, and why? So I'm going through the chat here as well. I'm reading all of these suggestions. What a wide range of ideas here, everything from society to trust and truth, intentionality. Trust seems to be quite a big one here, and truth. And that is, I believe, a fascinating conversation around yourself and your truth, as well as the truth that emerges in a policy advocacy setting. So I'd love to give a real-time example. So in this Family's First Act, my work every day is to advocate for a program that we call 30 Days to Family. And 30 Days to Family is a program that in that first precious 30 days, when a child comes into foster care, we work to get that child out of foster care and with their family. And so the bane of my existence for the past year has been to share this idea of 30 Days to Family with state governments and advocate for them to weave it into their state budgets as part of this Family's First Act. And I have not been successful. And it's not for lack of trying. And so a lot of times what I've been doing is showing up and saying that this 30 Days to Family program doesn't completely fit into the Family's First Act in every single I dotted and T crossed, but is absolutely needed in the big picture of how the child welfare system is moving forward. And I'm wondering to all of you, as the chat box is really alive with the number of things here, is it a situation where me as an authentic advocate for this program, 30 Days to Family, should not say, I'm sorry, it doesn't fit into your policy, but it's needed? Or should I be working on ways to actually just fit it and contort the idea into the policy structure? And does authenticity get compromised in such a situation? And those are the types of questions that I believe are imperative to be thinking in a policy and advocacy structure. And Dan and Janet and Atia, if you see any of the compelling questions to ask as well, I'm happy to go in that direction.
We have a few that are mostly about the actual policy. So I'd like to kind of steer people to maybe learn a little bit more about the policy online. That I didn't know if you really wanted to talk about the specific Family First policy, or we're really just using it as a case study to have a conversation about authenticity in advocacy.
Absolutely. I mean, I'm happy to answer a couple questions if people need a little more kind of understanding of the policy in order to use it as a case study. But the intentionality there is any new policy that is a complete game changer. And in this particular policy in the child welfare field, how you authentically show up and what of these words on the screen resonate the most with people. Would you mind, Atia, asking a couple of those questions about the policy itself, and then we can get into some summarization of these pieces of feedback?
Yeah, so someone was asking a little bit more about preventing abuse in state-sponsored and operated foster and group homes. Was there anything in the policy about preventing abuse in state-sponsored and operated foster and group homes? And they were citing some examples specifically in Missouri of group homes that have been sued for abuses. They also asked about families that are not able to care for biological children in internal families. And then also a little bit about LGBTQ plus, that are unhoused after aging out of foster and group homes. And I don't know if you had any specific information about those topics related to the policy.
Yeah, no, I so appreciate that. There will be lots of aspects of the outputs of the policy that address those issues, but the big picture of the Families First policy is saying that foster homes and group foster home, group care or residential facilities need to be focused very clearly on reintegration with the community, with biological parents as being number one, and support for biological parents. So the idea of abuse that's happening within the foster system, the idea of how we embrace LGBTQ plus youth, carers, and the whole gamut of people associated with the system, all come in the outputs of the policy. The policy is a budget policy that's really changing the way that the money flows and the way that children are served, to look at communities being empowered to take care of children so they never come into the system.
Yeah, so then we do have a comment from someone who's, and this was interesting to me too, that they mentioned that there's an issue when authentic advocacy meets non-authentic systems. And I thought I'd bring that one to light.
Oh, I'm so grateful for that. Well, and it nods to, and it's the reason why I talked a little bit about the bureaucratic nature of child welfare in this particular case study. So the idea of, as an authentic advocate, I know many people, including myself, that want to see children supported in their best interest individually in every case. And that's actually United Nations Convention on the Rights of the Child language, that a child's best interest should be determined. But at that time, when we are advocating for that to happen, it's against, or at least often in conflict with the system that is all about ticking boxes and, unfortunately, or has traditionally been, removing children. And so the resilient factor there that we're finding in a number of pieces of research around authenticity is the idea that the informed and authentic view that includes often life experience and a why is the most powerful thing to go against, or help convince, or help change, or help influence a system that seems to be the antithesis of authenticity at its most extreme sense, and or at least at odds with authenticity in a more general sense.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for that. In my past life, one of my past lives, I actually got to work with a wonderful organization that works with foster care that are aging out of the system. And one of the things we did with them was we helped them learn how to tell their story, because their testimony was so powerful in Congress and in other places. Their stories and their testimony, their personal testimony about their stories, was an incredible catalyst for conversations, for authenticity, and for change. And one of the things I'd like to ask you is about telling our own stories. When we bring ourselves into these spaces, one of the things we did was, it can be traumatizing though, a little bit, if you don't have some training or grounding, I think, in learning how to tell your own story. It takes real skill. And sometimes we need coaching and support in the places where we're going to bring our story to bear into the advocacy space. Is there anything you want to talk about with that?
Yeah, thank you. There's a lot to talk about that. Absolutely, what you said, I think, is the fundamental aspect of, if authenticity, part of that authenticity is telling your story in an advocacy or policy space, it's important that you are not setting yourself up to be tokenized, or for somebody to see you as being the weak kind of representative of this just kind of non-strengths-based narrative. However, some of the best lived experience and storytelling is when somebody is able to share their story and radiate their story in a way of strength, realism, truth, and honesty, because I see throughout this chat box talking a lot about truth as being a tricky subject to think through. But When somebody shows up and telling their story in a way that says, look, this is authentically me, the experience I've had in regard to this topic, and I am sharing this intentionally and sharing that why, it can be game changing. But if somebody, which we've seen traditionally in policy settings, people bring in young people in this particular case with lived experience, ask them to tell a sob story about how the system harmed them, and then don't appreciate them and listen to their voice and allow them and give them the preparation beforehand to, in a strengths-based way, feel like the reason they were there was to help move along that chart that I showed before, help an early adopter become an early majority and a late majority. And so I think we are learning as a field so much about the power of storytelling and the way to use storytelling so that people do not become tokenized.
Thank you so much for that. And I think you got some applause from the chat as well, who just wanted to reemphasize that those who have stories do not have to share everything about themselves. Part of sharing your story is that you are in control of what people are allowed to hear. So I really appreciate that, this dialogue.
Yeah, it's a fascinating aspect of things. And the other thing that is really a positive thing for authenticity infusing itself into this policy space is the idea that, at least in child welfare, but I've seen it also in the health field, the idea that people are being compensated now and recruited into positions because of their lived experience. And that lived experience, I believe, is that self that we started with in the definitions in the beginning. The idea that somebody's situation, no matter what it is, uniquely forms their ability to influence a certain situation. And when we're able to use those things in a positive way, it is powerful beyond belief. Dan, Janet, Atia, what else are you seeing in this?
I chimed in with something that jumped out to me as folks were brainstorming and reflecting and reacting, and the thought about, you know, some of the realities of incrementalism within systems to broad systems change that people are interested in advancing, and some of the strategies, how that connects to authenticity, and then one of the questions in particular, thinking about being strategic in terms of what you're advancing, perhaps a trial program or a pilot to lead into something bigger or larger, longer term.
Yeah, thank you for that. I mean, that's actually, this has been a very interesting kind of global debate recently about how these big reforms roll out and whether implementation planning in incremental measures is the most successful way, whether painting a wide canvas of this is where we need to go and please you all figure it out. If that's the way to go, those are both the extremes or somewhere in between. And what we're finding very often is that youth voice, people showing up, designing the movement in whatever is being asked is the most important piece. So basically, take families first and the idea that the entire child welfare system is being asked to think completely differently and start at a different place. People's stories and experience with the system is important. People who understand incremental change and the idea of how to go from step one of piloting things to step two, to step three, evaluation, research, redesign, all of those aspects. How is that being overlaid with people's lived experience, with constant dialogue like we're having right now, that is real, honest, but also in a structure that is strengths-based and is founded in people being allowed to share their why. And once all of those things are able to come together in spaces like this and policy spaces and policy discussions, then we see the needle move towards social change in an incredible way. And unfortunately, in a lot of policy rooms, and a state legislator, for example, who is booked out for 3 months and you get 2 minutes to talk to them about a certain thing, it gets very difficult to figure out how to authentically show up when you know all you need is to get this, this, and this done, and then maybe you can open the door for other things. And so strategy is imperatively important, overlaid with the idea that you don't want to compromise yourself and your truth at the same time. And one last comment about that, and then I'd love to continue to dive deeply into this. We're finding also that human beings are often leaning towards this idea of being binary in every way you can think of. But the idea that if two truths can exist at one point, and that you can own that in a policy room, for example, if a state legislator, if I say to them, this program that I'm working on doesn't exactly fit into this new legislation, but it fits in the tone and the movement and every other aspect of the intentionality of this legislation. And both of those things exist, and can we please find a way for it to work? The spaces for those conversations and people's familiarity and comfort with those conversations, I believe, is imperative as we move forward to actual change sustaining. What else are you all seeing in here?
It's okay. I had a question too. I'm looking at this list of concepts and words that you have on this slide, and I'm seeing at the top trust and truth, and then I'm seeing towards the bottom code switching and cultural competence. And so I know there's so many different ways that people experience life and truth and share that. The thing I want to ask about is if we're bringing authentic advocacy invites us, I think it probably requires us to be honest as much as possible, to own our truth and speak our truth. And at the same time, talk a little bit about code switching, because often, in cultural competency, because oftentimes code switching is seen as inauthentic and also necessary as part of the process.
That's very powerful, and something that I have felt constantly in my international work, and something that I've seen young people, especially young people who've aged out of the foster care system, that have been in multiracial households and have thought through how they show up. I've seen it over and over again. It comes back to being able to be comfortable with your why, and often overt. So the idea of, if somebody says, all right, in this particular room right now, I am showing up this way, and I just want to let you know this is why I'm showing up this way. So for example, in India, sometimes I showed up in a policy setting as an international adoptee from India that had something to say in a strengths-based way. Other times I showed up as a social worker working in India who had been on the ground for 5 years, and I wanted to share that experience. And sometimes I showed up as a global advocate who'd been traveling around the world. Now, the temptation would be for people to be like, you never know what that guy's going to do. You never know how he's selling himself or showing up with himself. So what I realized after hearing a number of those criticisms was that I was able to own the hat that I was wearing, or the reason that I was sharing something in a certain tone or vein during a particular policy setting. And that was powerful beyond belief, because then it wasn't something like I'm saying, look, I'm not withholding truth. What I'm saying is that I know there's only a short amount of time that I have in front of you. And so therefore I'm bringing concept A, B, C, and D here. And then I'm ready always to talk about those things offline. And so code switching is a perfect example where as our world becomes more and more multi-dimensional and you're moving about in electronic spaces, you're moving about the world is opening up where you have multiple backgrounds, cultures, ethnic backgrounds, everything you can think of all in one place, and increasingly in a policy setting. It's important that people know that they are able to own that switch and not feel like it's compromising self.
Thank you so much for that. And then I do want to, there's a comment in the chat, there's just seeking some clarity around the term resiliency and what is it intended to mean here. You know, the comment specifically says resilient is a sticking point for me because I constantly say, as somebody who's gone through hardships, I don't want people to try to make me resilient. I want people to make a world that is safe for children. So just a little clarity on what resiliency means in this context.
I do love that. So actually resiliency here was sticking out the policy process and actual kind of looking at that big picture change that us as change makers, people who are trying to influence policy and advocacy, it's usually not a day-long process. And the idea of being resilient throughout and the difficulty it takes, like let's take code switching, for example. Say, for example, that you have realized that in the last 7 or 5 advocacy settings, without even knowing it, you code switched and you showed up as a different version of you. And then you yourself have to figure out, okay, what am I going to do? How am I going to own this? How am I going to resolve this within myself? And then you hit a wall. And then your policy advocacy and policy work isn't moving forward. And then you make a breakthrough. It is a process. And that's why we look at all of these different aspects and how complex they may be. But the resiliency of somebody in this space is very important, and then weaves completely into authenticity, where sometimes you just have to be kind to yourself and realize that this has been such a hard process, and even figuring out how I show up in this process has been difficult. And the more you're able to own that and verbalize it, the more we'll have people who are influencing advocacy and policy to, I believe, be able to be more successful, to create more sustainable change by truly infusing their struggles and successes into the process.
Absolutely, thank you. And I think the panelist who wrote about that thanks you also and says, yes, displaying resiliency in the struggle. Definitely perseverance is required for this work. You mentioned change just now, and we had someone earlier said, systems give a lot of lip service to change, but they're notoriously slow in actually doing it. And so the audience, not the panelists, but the audience member asked about the possibility of getting buy-in to do trial programs to demonstrate evidence, the evidence base that something works. Because oftentimes systems will get stuck in the identifying the problem and without working towards the solution.
Yep, and there's no doubt that that's one of the pivotal waypoints on the journey of actually reaching social change, is the idea that you have to prove your product. And that's when we were looking at that chart of moving from early adopters to an early majority. It moves from that sales mentality of, hey, trust us, this is a good idea, to the proof of product. You need some pilots that show people that your new idea, or whatever idea it is, will actually work. So again, using Families First as a test case. Right now, the Annie E. Casey Foundation, Casey Family Foundation, Annie E. Casey, the Children's Bureau, a number of people have come together and looking for tier 1 and tier 2 states to pilot innovative pockets of child welfare so that people can see this stuff actually works, and then think through the scaling and replication aspects of things. So that is a fundamental waypoint. But my question, which I always come back to, and the reason that we're here, is the idea of when you are piloting something, how do you not just try to tick boxes and do what you suspect is being asked of you, but really what you are passionately driven to do, and the reasons that you and the community that you're advocating for is showing up? And how do you make sure that those two things are not dissonant, but actually work in concert?
Well, wow, because another one of the audience members earlier, and I'm going to look for their comment because I don't want to get it wrong, but she said, seems like some wisdom that was passed down to her was to ask for what you need and not for what you think they will give you. And I think what you just said spoke to that comment that showed up earlier in the chat.
Yeah, and Dan, I'm sure you can speak to this as well, but what I've seen in policy spaces is that idea that if you only have 2 minutes in front of a policymaker, you need to say exactly what they need to hear in that moment to get your agenda done. And I believe a lot of times in that, then you put whatever you wanted to ask on the back burner. And so that is what I hope this discussion is kind of whetting the appetite for, is thinking more deeply about how can you do both. So yeah, any reactions or thoughts to that?
Yeah, as I'm kind of looking back through the chat as well, you know, I thank our attendee and their great point and contributions, words of wisdom that have been passed down and beyond. Something you said earlier, Ian, has really kind of stuck with me also, you know, earlier in the presentation, where you asked the question, you know, what do I say in this moment? And then also, as I'm kind of also taking a look and soaking in the intersections between all these terrific concepts and these different ideas and strategies on the slide, intentionality has actually been standing out to me more and more as we've been talking through as well. And that, you know, you can authentically wear different hats. You can authentically, you know, advocate for, you know, different causes and champions and time frames, immediate action versus long-term strategy. But that whether you're in the moment itself, or that it's intentional, what you're lifting up and what you're leading, and how that can be a real asset and a real instrument to then accomplishing and achieving your long-term goals, which, if doing policy work well, is very much, to some of the comments that have come through the chat, driven by community and driven by the folks who are impacted. So thanks to the attendee who mentioned, you know, that when doing a pilot, you know, from the very beginning to be incorporating the people who are affected, the people who would be participating, you know, in terms of the design and the lifting up of it, the conceptualization of it and beyond. So Ian, you know, kind of one of the questions, just to come kind of full circle around the intentionality side, is, you know, I know a lot of folks who I've been talking to recently are kind of thinking about kind of hyper focusing in on a very narrow specific topic or problem, or working much more broadly and generally, either in a larger kind of issue area or even across issue areas. So when you're kind of thinking about your own work, you know, how have you kind of gone back and forth between needing to advance one change or conversations around kind of a specific question or a specific problem that keeps you up at night, versus kind of like the broader systems or policy change that I know that, you know, we've had conversations about you being interested in?
Yeah, I think it all comes down to strategy, and then honestly, your own time management and what keeps the lights on. It's all the things to think about at once. And in a perfect example, as I mentioned, this 30 Days to Family program that we're working on, that's fairly specific for children that come right into foster care. But the idea, big picture of how is families first as it evolves and maybe goes into another policy iteration in 4, 5, 6 years, how is that being influenced as well? And I think I personally, to answer your question, I would look at how much time do I have? What do I need to sustain the organization that I'm running or the idea that I'm running? And how does that all balance out? But to wrap it back to intentionality, what I know my intention is to help families and children throughout the world be seen more and empowered to be able to fend for themselves, to flourish for themselves, to thrive. And so I know that no matter what I'm doing, and life might go in chapters as well, whether it is a micro program or whether it's a macro advocacy or both at the same time. I hope that that kind of bigger picture of what I'm driving to do becomes kind of the North Star of the work.
Well, I wanted to jump in for a second. We've had a couple requests in the chat, Ian, for folks that would love to have access to your slide deck. Is that something that you would be okay with us posting on our website?
Absolutely.
Okay, then we've sort of restructured the Open Classroom webpage, and there's a page that's specifically dedicated for this purpose. I'm going to throw the link into the chat for everyone. The presentation is not there yet, but if you grab it, I'll get it there in just a few minutes, and I'll throw that in the chat now. We are nearing an hour, and gosh, what a robust conversation. Ian, are there any final thoughts that you'd like to leave this audience with?
I'm very moved by the chat, the kind of pivot on the idea of truth and kind of the deep dive into a lot of these terms. And what I hope is kind of a wrestling with how do we look at some of these things that are pretty pivotal and I hope align with a lot of people's individual values, the idea of being truth, the idea of showing up as themselves, while still trying to get work done and while still trying to influence things within rigid systems or bureaucratic systems. And so I think what I've seen here is what I hoped for from this discussion was people kind of just questioning, okay, how do I infuse myself, but hopefully how do I encourage others to infuse their truth into situations where normally there wouldn't have been a value around it, or at least not an open invitation. And so I hope that people take away from this the invitation, request, or even urging from me here to really think through which of these concepts sits with you the most, and how can you bring that concept and yourself to a table where you're advocating for either policy change or whatever type of change you're looking for.
So well said. Ian, thank you so much for spending this time with us. Atia and Dan, beautifully done to facilitate a conversation with, gosh, such an engaged audience. I want to thank everyone who's participated for your sharing and just engaging so beautifully in this topic. We are at time, so I'll take this opportunity to say goodbye and wish everyone a great rest of your day. Please stay healthy and safe out there, and we hope to see you very soon at another Open Classroom. Take care, everybody. Goodbye.